Welcome to this RSIS webinar by Dr. Kilian Spandler on saving people or saving things, narratives in the humanitarian order in Southeast Asia. My name's Al Cook and I will be moderating this session. A couple of housekeeping announcements. Please note the chat function at the bottom of your screen and insert your questions there. And I will then ask Kilian those questions in the question and answer session at the end. Today, Dr. Spandler will be speaking to us on the regional humanitarian order in Southeast Asia. Kilian Spandler is a researcher at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. His work explores the conditions of global and regional governance, both historically and against the background of the current transition towards a post-Westphalian or post-Western world. He's the author of Regional Organizations in International Society, published by Palgrave in 2018, and he is currently working on a number of projects, and a fuller bio has been circulated to you. Dr. Spandler will speak for around 30 to 40 minutes. We will then begin the Q&A session afterwards. So without further ado, Kilian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Al. And thanks also for the invitation to speak today at RSIS. It's been kind of a long-standing wish of mine to come to Singapore and visit RSIS. And to do that now, at least virtually, is a great privilege, and I really appreciate it. And also thanks to all the participants for coming today and listen to me speak a bit. Right, so in 2018, I went to Jakarta to talk to some people involved in humanitarian governance in Southeast Asia. And my goal was to understand some of the, basically the role of ASEAN's fledgling humanitarian agency or disaster relief agency, the AHA Center, its role as an emerging humanitarian actor in the region. And specifically, I was interested in understanding why, despite all the talk of partnership and coordination and a humanitarian architecture in the region, why was there so much uncertainty in the regional governance of HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief? I came there basically immediately in the immediate aftermath of the Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami. And it was quite palpable, the confusion about who would lead the relief efforts, about even who would be let into the country, which external organizations would actually be able to get down onto the ground where the wave hit. So that really threw the frictions between established humanitarian community, in quotation marks, and ASEAN member states in quite sharp relief. Although there was, of course, coordination and cooperation going on, there were some frictions. And my hope was with this trip to also start finding out about the underlying reasons for those frictions or issues. But I quickly came to the realization that I won't be getting, by talking to the different stakeholders, neat analyses of the sticking points in the humanitarian governance, no straightforward lists of strengths and weaknesses and points of views of the AHA Center. But what people did instead was tell stories. And I still remember, for example, a staff member of the regional office of OCHA, so of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, who recalled a meeting in the context of a disaster relief operation where they were sitting there and thinking to themselves, well, 10 years ago, I would have been at the top of the table, sitting at the top of the table. Whereas now, actually, I'm only sitting on the side of the table. And that's, of course, that's a very brief, very small kind of story, but it actually reveals a lot. And this was not a kind of a list of facts. This was not a straightforward, analysis. They didn't say OCHA is being, I don't know, sidelined or becoming less and less important as an actor in humanitarian governance in the region, but instead there was this kind of little narrative. So narratives in their simplest definition are stories, you could say. They have a plot. So they're not just an enumeration of facts, but they have a kind of a beginning and an ending. And realizing that I was basically encountering a lot of storytelling in these interviews that I did with experts from different humanitarian organizations and governance and ASEAN diplomats, I realized that this is actually quite logical and maybe even too expected. Because narratives, what they do is they help people to make sense of personal experiences. For example, now the story that I just told you about my research trip is also a way of, for me to make sense of how I came about writing this paper, of course. And at the same time, they also provide a sense of order to social life. And this to me suggested that they were particularly helpful as analytical lenses also to understand the dynamics that we see in regional humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in Southeast Asia. And it is so for 3 reasons, I would say. So the first reason is this, of course, disasters disrupt everyday life worlds and social orders. So storytelling can be an attempt at reinserting a kind of understanding and making sense of what has happened. That can be done by quite different authors of the stories. So of course you have news reporting, which often comes direct in the direct aftermath of disasters, and while they are unfolding, often then with a quite sensationalist approach, sensationalist metaphors, like if you think back to the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, I have some headlines here. There's talk about killer waves, about catastrophe. These are, of course, all specific ways of presenting what happened. And then, of course, also that happens because these newspapers want to increase readership. But then you have also, so going forward, you often have more, you could say, reflective interpretations of what has happened in literature and film. Again, if you talk about the Indian Ocean tsunami, one example is Sonali Dheranyagala's memoirs of the Indian Ocean tsunami called Wave. And you have that happening for a lot of major disasters, of course. But then storytelling can also be a kind of coping mechanism by affected communities, as they are documented, for example, in the book After the Tsunami by Anne-Marie Samuels. Again, here the purpose is often also to re-establish a kind of order, but also a way of overcoming trauma. But stories in communities can also be a resource for disaster preparedness, actually. So if you think about cautionary tales of giant waves in Indonesian coastline communities, those are, of course, also can be used to recognize disasters about to happen. They can be resources to establish practices, how to respond to those kinds of disasters early on, and so on. The second, so that was the first reason, the disruption of order. The second reason is that these notions of risk and exceptionality that come with disasters make narratives important devices that enable certain practices of governing these disasters. So, for example, prevention and response. And that's why narrative techniques are also used by those involved in the governance of disasters, such as government authorities or a variety of the whole variety of agents in the humanitarian sector. Now, these kinds of narratives, especially those by government authorities and humanitarian agents, also have very real world effects. And I have an example or an interpretation of that by Rebecca Solnit here, who wrote a book about Hurricane Katrina and how that has been sort of represented in the media. And she writes, hundreds of people died in the aftermath of Katrina because others, including police, vigilantes, high government officials, and the media, decided that the people of New Orleans were too dangerous to allow them to evacuate the septic, drowned city or to rescue them even from hospitals. So she refers here to the kinds of rumors and media coverage which tended to describe the situation in sort of the ground zero in New Orleans as rife with rape, murder, and chaos, and so on. And these kinds of representations then have very real effects. They seriously affect both the anticipation of disasters, but also, of course, then the relief efforts. And ultimately, they also have an impact on how many lives can be saved. The third reason for looking at narratives in the regional governance of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in Southeast Asia is that the very notion of order in that field of governance is problematic. So if you look at sort of the humanitarian governance traditionally speaking, it was quite Western-centric, quite hierarchical, dominated by United Nations agencies and their ideas of humanitarian architecture, which was, which had on top global coordination bodies like UN OCHA, and then links up to the nation states of the affected states through coordination bodies and national so-called clusters, which were led by the respective UN agencies. And there's just an example of how UN OCHA themselves have tried to visualize this rather hierarchical system. And not going into detail, but I think it's pretty obvious that the main structuring line is top-down. Now, ever since the mid-2000s, ASEAN has started intervening in this system in quite substantial ways. In 2005, so roughly 1 year or not even 1 year after the Indian Ocean tsunami, with preparations actually going back further than the tsunami itself, ASEAN member states signed the Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, in short, ADMER, which is sort of one of the only legally binding regional arrangements on the governance of humanitarian affairs, and sort of sets or disaster relief affairs, and sets a framework for member state cooperation on those issues. And then to sort of put that into practice, or one of the main mechanisms to put that into practice, in 2011, the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Cooperation on Disaster Relief, in short, the AHA Center, became operational. And ever since then, it has become more and more active in a variety of disaster governance activities, such as disaster monitoring and analysis, preparedness and response, and capacity building, especially for the member states and their national disaster management organizations or agencies. So with these mechanisms, ASEAN contributes further to an already quite complex field of governance. So what we have now is a plethora of local, national, regional, and global actors, from governmental agencies, but also non-governmental sectors. And well, that of course brings with it questions of order and roles and responsibilities. And the established actors who responded to this emerging regional actorness or agency trying to account for these developments by integrating them into this idea of an architecture at first. And to some extent, that has also been successful, to be sure. But at the same time, there's a continued uncertainty over roles and responsibilities as, for example, the aftermath and relief efforts after the Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami in 2018 demonstrated. So an architecture in the proper sense of the word has not really emerged. And my research looks at narratives to explain why. This is the article that has recently been published in the Pacific Review called Saving People or Saving Face: 4 Narratives of Regional Humanitarian Order in Southeast Asia, in which I try to provide some answers to that question. The goal, as I said, was making sense of these tensions or frictions in the regional governance of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, especially in terms of uncertainty over the division of labor and the respective roles of agents in concrete post-disaster settings. And the article tries to do so by investigating the narratives through which different agents construct the role of the AHA Center. So the AHA Center as the main regional mechanism is sort of my focal point of this analysis. The article, by the way, is open access on the Pacific Review's website, but I can also, if you get in touch afterwards, and I have the contact details at the very end of my slides, feel free to get in touch, and I can also send you the link or a copy. Yeah. So more concretely, what I do in the article is drawing on the work of international relations scholars like Alistair Miskimmen, Ben O'Loughlin, and Laura Rossell, who have established the notion of narratives as practices that can be used to represent and legitimate and also to contest ideas of international order and apply that to the regional level in Southeast Asia. And the conceptualization more specifically is that, also in terms of how do I understand narratives? Narratives are discursive accounts that are organized around plot structures. So as I mentioned, usually stories, as opposed to other kinds of texts, they have a beginning, a transitional phase, and an ending. They also often have then typical kind of patterns in how these stories unfold. So for example, through quests, heroic quests or stories of tragical failure. So you have all these tropes of trials and so on, and personal growth or personal failure. And they have role constructions, which also galvanize sort of these ideas of, morality and so on. So most of the characters in stories are usually people to identify with or to see critical in a critical light. Yeah, many texts display these kinds of narrative structures, even if they are not explicitly written as stories. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of once upon a time moment for a story to be, or for a text to be a narrative. And these narratives, what they do for these actors is that they transport ideas about not just how they see the world as, how they perceive the reality of the world, but also about the legitimacy of different actors. So as I said, coming with these character constructions or role constructions, you often have a kind of, value judgment of these actors, and also the broader order in which they are embedded. So the broader context, many stories are hidden criticisms of, contemporary social orders, of course. And that's a very important point, as we will see in the case of humanitarian governance in Southeast Asia. Yeah, and based on these ideas, the paper basically develops a narrative analysis of different textual and oral official sources. So I'm looking at official publications I looked at publications by different humanitarian actors in the region, both state and non-state, mostly state and regional organizations though, but also the International Federation of the Red Cross, for example. I also conducted interviews, as I mentioned, with representatives from these organizations, even looking at some social media posts and so on, just to get a general overview of the kinds of ways in which humanitarian governance, and especially the AHA Center, is being conveyed, or is being constructed, is being presented or represented. And I found that we can organize these ways into 4 different narratives, and I'll go through them now with a quick overview. The first is, well, maybe to start with, it's important to note that this is an analysis of different ways of representing or ways in which the AHA Center's role is represented. It's not an attempt to judge which of these narratives are closer to reality or more true, or I'm also not personally subscribing to any of these claims that are being made in these narratives. It's just a way of mapping these different perceptions and the views of regional order that come with them. So that's just a disclaimer, basically. And the first narrative is what I call the affirmative narrative, where the AHA Center basically appears as a kind of hero. So it is portrayed in quite positive terms, a hero that faces certain struggles. So it's a quite typical story of going through trials and mastering them or persevering through them through strength of character. So that actually pertains to both the individuals that are working for the AHA Center in some ways, as well as the organizational culture of the AHA Center as a whole, which is seen as characterized by, virtues like humility and passion and solidarity and so on. And it's also a story of growth from the humble beginnings of the center to increased professionalism, also growing through challenges like actual disaster relief operations. And the gradual development of an effective governance, which is achieved in partnership with others. I have a picture that illustrates sort of this thought quite nicely. You have here on the left-hand side, and that's from an AHA Center publication. They have what's called the Knowledge Book series, which is a series of reports that tries to document the AHA Center's history and its activities and so on. And this picture displays a member of an AHA Center assessment team together with a United Nations staff member jointly assessing sort of the disaster aftermath in Tacloban City after Typhoon Haiyan had hit the Philippines in 2015. This story is mostly told by ASEAN representatives, by ASEAN organizations themselves, and of course also by the AHA Center. And it's also, in fact, in some ways reflected in some of the slogans that have been created around ASEAN humanitarian cooperation, such as the One ASEAN, One Response, which is also the title of one of the central, operationalizing documents or policy documents. So you see all of this quite affirmative representations of the AHA Center, primarily, maybe not much surprisingly, by ASEAN representatives themselves. If you look at Western organizations, you often have a more skeptical point of view. It's not exclusively promoted by Western representatives or representatives from external organizations. There's occasionally the odd AHA Center staff member, or who also join into providing a more skeptical narrative, where basically the noble ambitions, or let's say the good intentions of ASEAN governments and also the AHA Center itself are acknowledged or accepted, but it's contrasted with, or these goals are contrasted with its factual limitations, saying that because of a lack of resources, because of its restrictive mandate, you might know that the AHA Center is mostly active on natural disasters, and it has only occasionally engaged also in, let's say, more politically contextualized, or what's often called man-made or human-induced disasters. Internal divisions between member states, and also the perennial question of sovereignty and sovereignty concerns, all of those are seen as, preventing the AHA Center from effectively intervening in humanitarian governance. And if the AHA Center is to contribute more positively and more effectively, that's in the distant future. So for now, the narrative says we cannot expect much happening there. So in some ways, the AHA Center here appears more as maybe as a hero, but as a tragic hero, which is eventually not making the needed contribution to alleviating human suffering. Now, as I said, the skeptical narrative often acknowledges that things may improve in the future, but there are also some more principally critical, sorry, jumped over the slide, more principally critical accounts, which have as their goal to unmask sort of this lofty humanitarian rhetoric as basically being all about symbolic politics and just that, rhetoric, without much substance. And that, of course, then implicitly mostly also suggests some ulterior motives of ASEAN actors or regional actors. Eventually, this narrative says ASEAN governments are pursuing regime interests rather than acting in the spirit of a true humanitarian ethics. So what's often happening then is that they point to photo ops like this one, where there's a handover ceremony of relief items from the Singaporean government channeled through the AHA Center to Myanmar authorities in Rakhine State. And that photo op is seen as sort of more important than the actual substantial impact of aid, which is often described then as actually, not really living up to what is needed. So here then this idea comes in of, well, this everything or most of what ASEAN does in humanitarian governance is not about saving people, but it's about, saving face, allowing governments to remain in a kind of standing in good light or publicly in the eye of the public. But there's finally also a different perspective, which essentially says that saving people is not only reconcilable with saving face, but it may even depend on it. So effective humanitarian governance in the region may require this kind of trust building effort first, before then access to the affected areas will be granted, basically. And this is connected to a narrative structure that is essentially a tale of overcoming differences and tensions in the humanitarian sector. And there are, of course, a myriad of these kinds of tensions. You have competing interests of national agents versus external, international, global agents. And again, here the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 is often seen as an incisive moment where Indonesian authorities were partly overwhelmed with the massive influx of foreign aid workers into areas like Aceh, where there was a feeling of a loss of control, and also the huge bureaucratic task of managing this influx was seen as counterproductive, for example. So national versus international interests, also, of course, tensions between the norm of national sovereignty on the one hand and the attempts to establish and assert sort of global standards in humanitarian assistance, as well as the notion of universal humanitarian ethics. And all of these tensions are, of course, are seen as important characteristics of, or an important setting within which humanitarian assistance takes place. And what the AHA Center does, and what makes it so special in the eyes of those who adhere to what I call the transformative narratives, then, is that the AHA Center can mediate and reconcile these different aspects or interests or conditions. And that's probably also why it is plausible to have a regional mechanism. It's kind of intuitive that the regional here can serve as a mediating or intermediate level between global and national efforts here. Another formative experience that is often invoked here, especially by ASEAN diplomats who have been in the game a bit longer, is the role of ASEAN in the relief efforts after Cyclone Nargis had hit Myanmar in 2008, where ASEAN kind of also acted as an intermediary, enabling or making it possible for the UN to actually come into the country and help with the relief efforts. Right, so taking all these narratives together, what I see is that there is no overarching grand story emerging, but instead we have all of these narratives coexisting, basically, side by side, different actors promoting one over the other, so that overall there is really a kind of what Amitav Acharya, for example, would call a multiplex order, right? Especially so because these narratives, as I mentioned, they are not only saying something about the AHA Center and its legitimacy, but also of the broader humanitarian order, which still is, characterized by Western or liberal hegemony in a sense. So the affirmative narrative, for example, through its more heroic, you could say, description of the AHA Center legitimates the AHA Center, but it also at the same time affirms sort of this, through these notions of partnership and coordination and cooperation, the basic outlines of the existing humanitarian order. It does not really criticize anyone. The skeptical narrative also affirms the positive value of the existing order, often by also using established humanitarian actors as counterpoints to highlight what's wrong with the AHA Center, thereby delegitimating the AHA Center, at least to a certain extent. The critical narrative then also delegitimates the AHA Center, but is at the same time also a bit more ambivalent about whether humanitarian ethics are possible at all, sometimes implying, or true adherence to humanitarian ethics, often implying that everything that's being done is essentially political. So there you have a quite ambivalent description of what humanitarianism is about in the first place. And finally, in the transformative narrative, you have a sort of reversal of that, because the criticism of the humanitarian order in its Western-centric liberal forms is carried quite far, in the sense that the AHA Center is really there to bring together different perspectives and really transform the humanitarian sector. That's what I hear in quite simplistic terms tried to visualize with the pluses and minuses in the table. And if you have questions about that, we can also come back to it, of course. Right, so if we look at these very different ways of visualizing the AHA Center, the question is, of course, or of representing the AHA Center and thinking about all these frictions or the contestation of broader ideas of order. Of course, the question comes up, so is cooperation possible at all? Is there any common basis, common purpose for working together? And I would say that actually, yes, it's not like no cooperation is taking place, and we see that. So in order to understand that in the paper, then I try to explain how cooperation is possible despite these narrative divides, by drawing on the term of bricolage by Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, where basically what bricolage means, it means like do it yourself or a makeshift or something like that, meaning that individual accounts, so if you talk to individual people or if you read individual texts, they don't adhere to a single narrative, but instead what they do is that they draw on competing narrative repertoires, mixing different narratives basically. And I interpret this kind of phenomenon, this bricolage, this mixing of different narratives, as evidence for the strategic characteristic of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the region. So drawing on on heterogeneous narratives can be a way of addressing different target audiences and legitimating different organizations vis-a-vis those audiences. So if you look at, for example, and by that also navigating the asymmetric relations of dependency that still characterize or infuse humanitarian action in the region. By that I mean that there are still hierarchies in this governance field. So of course there's still, the people with the money and those who are dependent on that money, for example. But at the same time, everyone is dependent on everyone else in a way in order for effective governance to happen overall. And to navigate these unique conditions, I think that bricolage, drawing on different narratives, is very useful. And we see that, for example, when ASEAN diplomats, on the one hand, have to reassure donors, international donors, of their good intentions and of their cooperative stance, basically. But on the other hand, of course, ASEAN diplomats and the AHA Center itself is also bound by the mandate of its member states. So the AHA Center is basically an agent of the of ASEAN as its principal. So speaking to these different audiences then effectively leads representatives of the AHA Center and also ASEAN diplomats to try and mix both the transformative account, which is sort of more speaking towards ASEAN audiences. We want to actually change humanitarian action in the region, but at the same time using this affirmative narrative to satisfy the demands of international donors and the partner organizations. Yeah, we're all about coordination and partnership, and we want to be good friends and do everything together. So that's how I understand sort of this mixing of narratives, essentially. Yeah. So coming back to the very beginning, as I said, going to Jakarta, my goal was to understand these kinds of tensions and frictions and the continuing disagreement or uncertainty over roles and responsibilities in regional humanitarian governance and disaster relief in Southeast Asia. And what have I learned? Or what's the takeaway? I think, yes, the liberal humanitarian order is kind of being unsettled. So we have many actors in the region trying to project alternatives to this Western dominance and to the sort of some of the ideas that are carried with the idea with the system as it was. But at the same time, I would not say that we are seeing sort of a global versus regional clearly defined fault lines of an antagonism in that field. For one thing, I would say we have to also we must not forget that even ideas that come from the region are not necessarily anti-liberal, and a lot of the sort of the ideas around humanitarian assistance are quite compatible with sort of the liberal ideas of humanitarian ethics, for example. So it's not like there's a clear ideological conflict. There's also for the same reason, there's also no clear geopolitical conflict between the region and its exterior, because you also have, of course, internal differences over how to govern regional humanitarian affairs, essentially. And there, by using things like bricolage, we see also a basis for pragmatism and for joint action in responding to disasters gladly, or in a way. And sort of finishing this story, I think it does not have a happy ending in the strict sense of the term, but we can be sort of cautiously optimistic when looking in the future, in the sense that no, there is no grand architecture forthcoming. We won't have fixed certainty over, you know, a division of labor. And when we look at current disaster relief operations, that's exactly what's happening, right? So we often have ad hoc arrangements depending on the affected country, depending on the scale of the disaster, and on certain other factors. We have sometimes regional actors in the lead, sometimes the established UN actors in the lead. So then I would say that we have to live with this uncertainty, but at the same time, we can also have the hope that cooperation in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the region is always possible. And that's the end of sort of my story here and my narrative. And now I'm really looking forward to discussing with you, looking forward to your questions if you have any. And thanks again. And I'm ending the slide, I think, here. No, wait, I wanted to give you my contact details if you are interested, of course. Let's see here. You can take a note, make a note of those, of course. I'm also on Twitter if that's your jam. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you, Kilian, for a very interesting presentation of your recent article in Pacific Review. While people are thinking about the questions they want to ask you, I will start the ball rolling here. I'm just wondering, when you were conducting your research here, what was your interaction with the different narratives over what humanitarianism actually means and who it involves? And by that, I mean, often we see this, I would argue, a false dichotomy between traditional humanitarian actors and then this non-traditional humanitarian actor, right? So we would think of the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, etc. Whereas the non-traditional ones would involve governments, would involve regional organizations, militaries, and so forth. So I'm wondering what your take was on that when you were conducting your research, and how that influences the construction of those four narratives that you shared with us.
That's an interesting question. I think my attempt at an answer would be that I expected sort of a starker contrast in a sense. I was always trying to get people to, both the sort of the established and the new actors, to talk about humanitarian principles and their view on them, and whether, for example, the established actors saw them challenged or in danger by this new emerging actorness. And even those where I expected sort of a stronger pushback, like maybe some NGOs or the Red Cross societies, I got pretty cautious answers, or pretty, they were not, as I expected, maybe overly concerned, it seemed. Like they were acknowledging that there were different understandings of the humanitarian principles, but it didn't really seem like, it really seemed like they were emphasizing the ability to find agreement on at least a pragmatic, in a pragmatic way. So I would say that actually, especially when it comes to these things, when I prompted them to talk about humanitarian principles, I often got more affirmative accounts rather than sort of transformative or critical accounts, at least more so than I was expecting. There were the occasional exceptions to that. But that to me also suggests that what we see is not so much a fundamental opposition or antagonism, but more like a kind of a certain unease and a certain uncertainty about how things are going to unfold in practice, rather than a kind of expectation of ideological conflict.
Okay, we have a question here from Lena Gong. She's on the HADR program at the NTS Center here in RSIS. And she asks, what are the respective factors that contribute to or influence each of the narratives that you've laid out for us in your presentation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that really it mainly depends on who speaks and to whom they speak in a sense. So I think that, as I mentioned, like the ASEAN representatives, both in the ASEAN Secretariat, as well as in the permanent representations of the member states, for example, in Jakarta, they draw mostly on the affirmative narrative, I would say. So the choice is pretty clear, but then it also depends a bit on the forum, and it depends on whether this is an official publication or I'm talking to them in private, because then they, of course, people open up a bit more on the one hand. On the other hand, they are also very conscious, of course, that I sort of come in there as a researcher from Sweden, a white researcher from Sweden. So basically that has methodological implications that are quite interesting, of course. When you talk about things like bricolage, where people adapt their way of speaking and representing also to their audience. And that's something so you end up getting quite a complex factor of who is speaking, to whom are they speaking. They would then draw on different narratives if it was a public speech rather than a person-to-person interview, for example. That's a kind of a general answer to that question, I would say.
Okay, sure. With the different actors, one thing that I've noticed, and I'm wondering, what your reaction to this is it really depends on what sector we engage with and what language they use to explain their role and their involvement in it. So humanitarian traditional actors might use a certain turn of phrase to address some of those challenges in the field, whereas disaster management professionals use more technical terms and engineering terms and so forth. So I'm wondering, perhaps if you could tell us a bit about your experience in engaging in the different sectors that are engaged in humanitarian action.
That's a very good point, and I haven't I wish I had studied that more systematically. That's maybe a project for the future, I imagine. But I think what was pretty obvious is that you have different. It was quite obvious when talking to people in the ASEAN Secretariat as to where did they come from, what were their professional careers, and if they had, for example, been long-term bureaucrats in the field of disaster relief, then you could really feel a kind of more, as you say, a more technical language emerging in the interaction. You get a bit. Sometimes you also get a bit less of a true narrative. You get more like the facts and how sort of they envision the system and the different operations and how everything hangs together, the different bodies within ASEAN, for example. So I think that in the true sense of the word, probably the narratives are something that comes out more from the classical humanitarian sector, who I think also use those narratives to legitimate their personal involvement in these issues from the point of view of a very individual passion for these things and so on. And I think that narratives lend themselves more easily to, or for the purpose of making sense of these kinds of these kinds of experiences and motivations to engage in the governance field? It's a really interesting question that I would like to consider more in the future. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Chris, who asks, how do you see your research overlapping with rationalist and constructive approaches of regional governance?
Good question. So in the paper, I try to locate my approach a bit vis-a-vis these two alternatives. And I would say that I lean a bit more, obviously, perhaps towards the constructivist end. So what I'm observing in much of the literature that has been written in international relations, at least, on the AHA Center is often written actually with this idea of a governance architecture in mind. So it's a lot about evaluating the effectiveness of individual agents like the AHA Center. And then it's also considering the effects of this complexity, talking about regime complexity, for example, of the field and how it can sort of be managed in order to arrive at a concrete, in order to make disaster relief effective. So there, I think it's pretty clear that I'm not so much interested in these questions, at least for the purpose of that paper. With the constructivism, I think that there is more compatibility in terms of sort of the ontological, methodological foundations and so on. But what I see here is that the focus has so far often been on interpreting drivers or finding drivers behind the emergence of regional mechanisms in terms of what's often called diffusion. So the norms and institutional designs traveling from certain places, in that case, often sort of the global humanitarian community or sector towards different regions who then try to adapt to these norms or try to localize them in some instances, make them fit to regional purposes. So, and that's, of course, I mean, talking about normative backgrounds and so on, the normative conditions and how ideas travel is a question that's quite close to my own interest or my own perspective, but with different questions in mind, I would say. And what I would really like to reject is what's often kind of implicitly emerging from this kind of literature, these kind of divisions between the global level and the regional level with a sort of rather strict dividing line between the two. I don't think that's very accurate.
Okay, thanks. We've got a question from Nafa. How do you see the role of CSOs in the competing narratives of HADR or AHA in general towards their significance as actors involved in humanitarian affairs in Southeast Asia? And noting that ASEAN engages CSOs in the field.
Yeah. So, I mean, my interpretation of that would be that I think that CSOs have multiple entry points that they can draw on when they try to stake out a position in sort of regional humanitarian affairs here. They can, when you look at the narratives, I think there are a lot of points of entry or points of contact. So sort of the notion of civil society actors is, of course, compatible with the affirmative narrative, which sort of has this idea of partnership. And if you look at sort of the discourse that's also been promoted by the AHA Center in its publications on the issue, it's very much about extending this idea of partnership, especially in the more recent years, sort of in the second half of its 9-year existence. extending this idea of partnership also to non-traditional agents in the non-governmental sector. And I think that, as you mentioned, ASEAN does engage with civil society actors. I think that's only gonna continue in the future. And at the same time, if you look at the transformative narrative, I think here there's a lot of potential drawing on the notion of localization. The question is, of course, whether they are sort of how this localization idea is used in practice, because of course it can be appropriated by state actors also to stake out their own territory, right? So localization can be achieved by more national agencies. It can also be achieved by, I think that's the original idea, by local grassroots agents in the field and so on. So that's of course at the same time an entry point, but also a potential friction point in how the localization discourse is appropriated by different agents for their own strategic interests.
Interesting. I mean, this reminds me of a conversation at it was the ASEAN Strategic Policy Dialogue on Disaster Management, in which there was a panel discussion on localization, that's sort of the bugbear of the humanitarian community. And the local organization was Muhammadiyah, so a very well-established Indonesian organization, faith-based organization. And when they were asked about their position on localization, they simply said, we don't need to localize because we're already local. Like, what are you talking about? This whole dynamic of localization. And so even the debate largely seems, and I would be interested in hearing your perspective on it from where you're sat in Gothenburg, it seems to be very much a top-down driven discussion when we're looking at localization focused on largely UN agencies rather than any broader landscape of humanitarian actors in that discussion. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your take on it.
I completely agree. I think within, or sort of hooking onto the localization term are different narratives again. Like there is a narrative that simply tries to reinsert grassroots actors as someone who has always been there, and raising their visibility and their contributions that they have always made to disaster relief, always being the first ones on the ground and so on. So raising the visibility of already existing agents which have sort of been erased from the higher level discourses versus localization narrative that, in this top-down manner which you described, sees localization as devolution of decision-making and redistribution of funding and so on. And to some extent, of course, they go together, but to some extent they are also different perceptions of who really counts and who is a valid agent, and different perceptions of dependency and so on. If you have only the top-down devolution point of view of localization, you will easily end up seeing the grassroots organizations simply as executioners of the sort of the common will of the humanitarian community, which is sort of floating around somewhere on the global sphere, and that's not, I think, how it's supposed to be.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question here. Did regional norms, i.e. non-interference, the ASEAN way, etc., influence one or all four of the narratives? And if so, in what ways did it do that?
Yes, mostly. I mean, it influences the skeptical and critical narratives in sort of a negative way, or they appear in a negative way, in a negative light in these narratives, because non-interference from the skeptical point of view of those who want to make the case that the Western approach has its merits, sort of the liberal paradigm has its merits. From that point of view, non-interference can only be an obstacle to effective humanitarian action, because you want to be there as soon as possible. You want to have, you know, all these surge actions where you deploy then the humanitarian aid workers and organizations on the ground as seamlessly as possible. So non-interference then as a kind of pushback against this transversal of transgression into national territory is problematic from that point of view. So it's one of the obstacles that actually leads the AHA Center, despite its noble ambitions, to eventually fail, at least for the time being. And then there are even, you know, there are some academic contributions which fall into that category, which can be seen as grounded in that narrative, who say that normative prerogatives or normative conditions are problematic for effective humanitarian governance, and for the diffusion even of this idea of disaster relief as per the liberal paradigm. Now, in the I would say in the transformative narrative, which is you know, non-interference is either seen as something positive or at least as something that we have to accept also. So it needs to be clear that states do have concerns about their sovereignty and about their, you know, they want to keep a certain control over who comes in to their country in the aftermath of a disaster. And that, I think, is you know, what was so palpable in the 2018 disasters in Indonesia. So you also had the Lombok earthquake, where things were quite similar, where there was a clear push from national agencies to say that we got this, right? So we are responsible for this, and we have both the will and the capacity to handle this disaster ourselves. In Sulawesi, it was a bit more, you know, ambivalent. We do let external aid workers in, but you have to register with the AHA Center. We have to at all times know who is in. You also have to be registered as a local NGO if you want to come in, and so on. So these, in that way, non-interference ideas and national sovereignty ideas contribute to or play into this idea of how to change the humanitarian field for the better in the transformative narrative, with more regional and more local and more national ownership, I would say.
Interesting. I mean, I think we even see it in terms of the localization debate, that often people will use that as a way, and they're really talking about nationalization, right? Like reasserting traditional sovereignty norms by saying we're going to devolve power to the regional or national level. So it's being appropriated by those actors wanting less international engagement in the field, which is sort of an interesting development. I've got a follow-up question for you in terms of the research. You mentioned that often the actors engage in particular narratives for certain audiences. So which audience were you when you interviewed them? And I wonder if you're able to separate out the sort of the public and private sphere of the storyteller.
Yeah.
In that sense. So what do they really think versus what was it they thought you wanted to hear?
That is, I mean, that is the big question, of course, which I mentioned, that there are methodological challenges that to some extent cannot be fully untangled. Yeah, so I found myself somehow playing a lot of different roles also coming into this research and doing those interviews, because in some cases it was clear that the situation was, I was kind of being perceived as an outside expert, who did not himself have any kind of stakes in that debate. But in other cases, it was clear that I was seen as sort of a, someone with their own agenda and interests. So I had a very peculiar, interesting, for many reasons, interesting visit to the permanent representation of Myanmar to ASEAN in that context. And, people are, in some cases, very cautious about what they tell you, and they might also push certain opinions on you, which then might be very different, of course, in forums, in public forums. But of course, there are also situations that I simply don't have access to, right? So that's the eternal problem of ASEAN research is, of course, 90 or 95% of what seems to matter in this organization is completely inaccessible to researchers. So it's a difficult question, and also, of course, need to be aware of these limitations, of course, when interpreting the results. I also talked to people from the EU mission to ASEAN, to people at the German embassy, and it was obvious, of course, that I was the interaction was taking place on a very different playing field than if I went to, say, the Myanmar representation, or even the Indonesian people, or the people in the ASEAN Secretariat. Sometimes, but even there, it depends very much on the person. So you have people who are very frank in their conversations, and to be honest, of course, to some extent, the research community also knows who are the more frank people in the ASEAN Secretariat, so they sometimes get passed along as contacts if you want to have a certain more open view, and by that you gain sort of more talkative interaction partners, but you also get a specific point of view, of course, and then you sometimes end up talking to those people who are maybe representing the more open countries in ASEAN when it comes to sort of external assistance, also because they, are a bit less territorial or guarded about the role of national sovereignty and so on. But it's I take it as an interesting challenge to try to gain experience from these different kinds of interactions. But I'm also probably compared to other researchers and also to guests here, probably at the early stage of my learning curve here.
I'm just wondering if you had much interaction with some of those other non-traditional actors that you mentioned when you were conducting your research. So we've sort of checked the national agencies, we've checked the INGOs and UN offices. Did you engage much with private sector or the militaries? And if you did, what were sort of some of their telltale signs of their narratives? And would you differentiate out the narratives based on particular actors, or was it really a mix across the board between those different actors?
Yeah, short answer, I haven't talked to any one in the military. I haven't talked so much to private actors. I did talk to some people in sort of the more traditional NGO sector. I think so. To some extent, my perspective on this is limited, but overall, I would say that the variation within individual accounts, or the variation of accounts within one sector, was almost as big as the variation between sectors. So the amount of different narratives when you talk to people within the ASEAN Secretariat, for example, is almost as big as if you then switch over to talking to someone in the EU mission or in the Australian embassy or something like that. So that again speaks to I would say, to this idea of overlapping and mixing and kind of eclectic approach to these narratives, which is not to say that there are no patterns. There are patterns, and I try to highlight some of those patterns in the talk. But it would, of course, be super interesting to see whether that might change if you get someone from the military. And I was half aware of that discourse becoming stronger and stronger, sort of the civil military link in disaster relief and those kinds of things. But I hadn't made that the central attention point of my research back then. But it would be interesting. And I mean, some people at RSIS I know have worked on this. So if anyone wants to chime in here with some experiences, that would, of course, I think it's a webinar, so we can also have some interaction, of course, I guess.
Yeah, okay. I mean, what came to my mind really was at the beginning when you were talking about the UN global humanitarian architecture as hierarchical. And I think what we've seen is, you know, it's effectively like a command and control structure is what we're looking at. On that. And often what we see is when we're looking at the humanitarian space, that often those personnel in UN, particularly logistics functions, are former military personnel who have moved over into that. So that's sort of where I was thinking. And this sort of leads to my next question, which is really looking at the regional community. So would you go as far as to describe, given that you've got those 4 narratives that you've established, would you be able to say whether or not there exists a regional humanitarian community? And if so, what does that mean?
I think we certainly see a humanitarian network, and we see, you know, attempts to strengthen that network through various dialogue formats and you know, in typical ASEAN fashion, through this kind of this track 2 kind of diplomacy and so on. But also some kind of more open, inclusive, non-traditional ways. There seems to be, you know, happening a lot through interpersonal linkages, so person-to-person relations seem to be very important, which of course points to the notion of community in a sense. I'm wondering though whether you might need a more overarching, unifying narrative holding together these networks in order for them to actually become something like a community, as you mentioned. I think that your question goes kind of into that direction. What is a community, and does that apply to the field of agents and actors in the region? Of course, to some extent, also on the global level, the notion of a humanitarian community is always a kind of a floating signifier, and it's not really clear what is meant by this, and it's to some extent imaginative, right? And there are frictions and differences and antagonism on the global level as well, despite all the talk of you know, these people being led by a unifying or a sense of common purpose and so on, which I don't deny them. I don't say that. I'm not saying that they don't believe in that common purpose and so the principle guiding values of humanitarian ethics and so on. But at the same time, we cannot discard sort of the fact that speaking of humanitarian community is itself, again, a legitimating discourse, or you know, maybe even part of a narrative and so on. Yeah, and I think maybe there is a kind of embryonic humanitarian community that also is guided through things like the affirmative narrative, kind of a common quest, a common challenge, common purpose in solidarity. There are these kinds of metaphors of an ASEAN family, which is not, at least not in principle, limited to traditional actors, which aims to be inclusive. And we're talking about, of course, ASEAN becoming more people-centered and so on. And of course, there's a long way to go, but a kind of a nuclear community might be emerging.
So if we zoom out from the four narratives which look at this humanitarian network community, however you want to describe it, what we can tell by all of them is that it's an area where there are varying levels, perhaps, of cooperation. So would you hedge a guess, is this transferable, this experience, to other areas? People often will argue in the literature and so on that HADR is the first stop to build trust and cooperation amongst regional states. What's your take on that? Is it that, or do you think it's an end in itself?
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, as you say, I think we're leaving a bit the idea of the different narratives behind, and maybe, yeah, that's asking about my personal reflection on this. I think, yeah, I don't want to fall into the trap of seeing, HADR exclusively as an exercise in building trust, because research on disaster diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy shows that that's not always how it plays out, right? So disaster assistance can be a way of improving diplomatic relations between countries, but it doesn't have to be so. And it can even, the politics surrounding offers of assistance, acceptance of assistance, refusal of assistance, and so on, are also hugely political and not just, a one-way street towards building more trust. So I would kind of say that my overarching view of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is fundamentally political in the sense that it can be a way of also, it's not purely technical, it's not purely ethical, it's always also a matter of asserting authority, challenging established authorities, and so on. So there's always a strategic element. But in that very sense, I think it's also transferable, to answer your question, to other fields where that are characterized in the same way by the emergence of new actors, new regional agency, and so on. So I'm wondering about, for example, taking a current example of disease control or management of communicable diseases and so on. I know that Southeast Asia or ASEAN has not come very far in that policy field. But if you look at Africa, at the African Union, the general opinion seems to be that this has, the African Union has been quite strong and quite active in trying to counter the worst effects of the pandemic. And I think that this is a similar field it is a similar field to HADR in that it is also usually guided by both technical or more scientific, evidence-based issues and humanitarian concerns. But at the same time, it's also a place where power games are played out. So the African Union, of course, is also in establishing disease control centers, in fostering cooperation on these issues, is of course also staking out a claim to managing African affairs, providing, as the old slogan goes, providing African solutions to African problems and so on. So in a sense, there's of course now there's also debate to what extent ASEAN should step up its cooperation on COVID and potential future pandemics or diseases. So I think the basic dynamics of how these fields operate can be transferred. Yeah, there is something to be learned from looking at that at humanitarian assistance and disaster relief for regional and world politics as a whole.
Interesting. I mean, we've just had the ASEAN summit conclude, and I noticed that in there that they have now put on the table a proposal for ASEAN Coordinating Center for Public Health Emergencies. So, I mean, talking to the point there you raised about transference to issues like COVID and other health emergencies, let's say, it looks like they are indeed going in that direction. I'm just going to see if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a final question, and if there is anyone, please put it into the chat box, and then I will hand over to Kilian to offer some concluding thoughts, and we will then wrap up the webinar.
I can maybe mention that I got a question in the private chat.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead and answer that one.
On why do we need to have a grand architecture to begin with? So why do we have this question? And should it? I interpret the question as meaning, is that something that is worth aspiring to in the first place? And that's an interesting question if I understood it correctly, because of course maybe the whole idea of pursuing a kind of a fixed division of labor with clearly assigned roles and responsibilities and so on was wrong to begin with, and I would agree, and I would say that this is partly what my paper also wants to contribute to the debate, is that when we going back to the rationalist approaches to international relations apply to this field. I think the very idea that we can come up with a neat architecture relies on, or would require, that we have a common idea of what this order should look like. And I don't think we have a common, or at least we don't have one single coherent idea of how this order can look like, and who should have the say, and what norms should guide the interaction. Although there are ideas, and there's some sense of common purpose, but not enough to arrive at an architecture. And I think, again, I'm also comparing to other regions, because that's sort of part of my research. If you look at the African Union security governance, for example, we have the same trend towards more ad hoc arrangements when it comes to humanitarian interventions, when it comes to peacekeeping, peace operations. The idea of doing that with a clearly overarching general division of labor between the United Nations and the African Union, and then even there's another level with the regional, the sub-regional economic bodies, has proven elusive. There was a time when, the idea of a common sort of framework for these peace operations was pursued, but by now it's become pretty clear that what we really need is flexibility in approaching each of the emergencies or crises in their own right. And that's, I think, the same applies to Southeast Asian humanitarian assistance and disaster relief.
Okay, just I guess the last point would be, maybe you want to share with us the direction of your research, and what you're looking at, and potential areas for collaboration for people to get in touch with you. Mm-hmm. And then I'll close the webinar.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm currently working on a paper with Dr. Brooke Coe from Oklahoma State University, also looking at the AHA Center, where we try to tease out some of the implications from my previous research with a view to what are the political functions that the AHA Center really fulfills for the member states. Again, sort of pushing a bit back against these research, which is, or not pushing back, but providing a different perspective to those to the evaluations of the efficiency, looking into how does the AHA Center enable the ASEAN member states to do specific things, taking into account sort of the regional order questions that we brought up also during this talk. And we look specifically into sort of how the member states use the AHA Center to try to bring about this transformation of the humanitarian landscape towards more regional ownership or national ownership. We look into ways in which the AHA Center enables them to decide over basically fulfilling gatekeeping functions, so whether or not to invite external aid agents into the country after a disaster on their own terms. And finally, also into how the AHA Center then, and here it becomes deeply political, of course, how it enables them or how it contributes to their self-legitimation, both vis-a-vis domestic audiences and international audiences. And for future research, I would be really interested to, or I'm planning sort of research also comparing then different policy fields. And there, of course, the question of health governance becomes quite topical now. So I was really wondering why, as you mentioned, we start, or this sort of cooperation became so pronounced in the field of disaster governance, whereas it has really seemed to be falling behind on, issues like public health and the management of communicable diseases. So taking a comparative perspective here, looking into potential explanatory factors and so on, is something that I'm interested in, that I have some plans of doing, hopefully also at a point when you can travel again, but let's see.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And for anyone who wants to get in touch with Kilian, please see his slides and let him know. So with that, I'd like to bring the webinar to a close. I would ask the HADR team to stay behind. And I would like to express our thanks to Kilian for his very engaging webinar today. And we hope to see him and you all again soon. Please keep an eye out for our future events. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you, Al, and thanks to everyone at RSIS and the guests with their questions. That was really interesting for me too.